Indianapolis, May 15, 2026. Gainbridge Fieldhouse. The Indiana Fever are playing the Washington Mystics in the third game of the new WNBA season, and something strange is happening on the home bench. Caitlyn Clark, the franchise player, the most marketable athlete in women's basketball, the reason half the people in that building bought tickets, is sitting down. She has been sitting for almost 6 minutes of the second quarter. The Fever offense, without her, is falling apart. And the cameras keep cutting to head coach Stephanie White, arms crossed, watching her team unravel while her best player watches from a folding chair. By the end of the night, the Fever will lose in overtime, 104-102. Clark will finish with 32 points and 7 made three-pointers, including a dagger that forced the extra period. And by morning, the Indianapolis sports radio shows, the national basketball commentators, and a chunk of WNBA Twitter will be saying out loud what fans have been whispering since opening night. Stephanie White might not survive this season. Some of them are saying she might not survive this month. This is the story of how a coach who was supposed to lead Indiana into a championship era is now coaching for her job after 3 games. How a decision about substitution patterns became a referendum on whether she can manage the biggest star in the sport. How the leftover anger from last fall's commissioner scandal has somehow landed on her doorstep instead of where it actually belongs. And whether Caitlyn Clark, the player at the center of all of it, has the patience to wait for her coach to figure it out. Stay with me. The details on this one are messier than the headlines suggest, and most of the takes you have seen so far are missing the part that actually matters. Let's go back to that Mystics game, because everything that has happened since flows from it. The Fever came into the night at 1-1. They had lost their opener to the Dallas Wings and Paige Buchers, which stung, but losing your first game to the reigning Rookie of the Year is not the kind of loss that gets a coach fired. Then they had won their second game, looked decent, and headed into the home opener against Washington feeling like the season was about to find its rhythm. It did not find its rhythm. The Fever fell behind early. Clark was playing well, but the offense around her looked confused. There was no pick and roll with Aliyah Boston, the team's all-star center, which is the play that every analyst in the league has been saying for 2 years should be the foundation of the Indiana offense. Boston and Clark, the 2 number 1 overall picks on the same roster, were spending stretches of the game standing in different parts of the floor with no apparent plan to bring them together. Then, midway through the second quarter, Stephanie White made the substitution that started the fire. She sat Clark. Not for a quick breather. For close to 6 minutes of game time. With the Fever trailing, with the home crowd already restless, with the entire Indianapolis market watching their $300 ticket purchases play out without the player they came to see. The Mystics built their lead. The Fever offense bogged down completely. By the time Clark came back, the deficit was bigger than it had been when she sat down, and the Indianapolis crowd had gone from confused to openly angry. Clark, to her credit, did what Clark does. She brought the Fever back almost single-handedly. She hit 7 three-pointers. She scored 32 points. And with the game on the line, she made a step-back triple that tied the score and sent it to overtime. Gainbridge Fieldhouse was as loud as it has been in years. The team had a chance to steal a win, and for one possession at the end of overtime, it looked like Stephanie White had drawn up a play to get Clark a clean look at a game winner. She had not. Or rather, she had drawn up a play that used Clark as a decoy. With the Mystics double-teaming Clark on the inbound, the ball moved to Lexi Hull, who took the final shot. It did not fall. The Fever lost. And the moment the buzzer went, the conversation in Indianapolis changed permanently. Within minutes of the final buzzer, Jason Whitlock, the longtime sports media personality whose audience overlaps heavily with the demographic that has driven so much of the new WNBA interest, was on social media calling for Stephanie White's job. His words were not subtle. He said the loss should change everything in the Fever organization. He said White should be fired. He said the entire infrastructure built around Caitlyn Clark needed to be torn down and rebuilt, because, in his words, this is Caitlyn's team. He used the phrase, absolute coaching malpractice. He pointed to the rotation specifically, calling out the fact that Boston and Clark spent too much time on the floor without each other, and that even when they shared the floor, the offense did not run the pick and roll that would let them play to their strengths. Now, Jason Whitlock is a polarizing figure, and reasonable people disagree about everything he says. But when he tweets about Caitlyn Clark, his audience listens, and his audience is large. Within hours, hashtags about firing Stephanie White were trending in basketball circles. Local Indianapolis sports talk radio devoted full shows to the question the next morning. Robert Griffin III, the former NFL quarterback who has become one of the most consistent defenders of Clark in national media, weighed in with his own thoughts about the criticism Clark was taking and how it tied back to her coach. The conversation escaped containment. And here is what made it different from the normal early-season grumbling that every team's fanbase produces. The criticism was not vague. It was specific. It was about a 6-minute stretch of bench time in the second quarter. It was about a final possession where the best three-point shooter alive was used as a decoy. It was about an offensive scheme that had 2 number-1 picks on it and could not figure out how to use them together. These were not the complaints of fans who do not understand basketball. These were the complaints of fans who understand basketball perfectly well and were watching choices being made that did not pass the smell test. The Fever's record after 3 games was 1-2. That alone is not catastrophic. A lot of teams start 1-2. But when a coach starts 1-2 while making decisions that the broader basketball world is openly calling coaching malpractice, the runway gets very short very quickly. And Stephanie White, as of the morning of May 16th, had a very short runway. Before we go further, let's slow down, because if you have been hearing about Stephanie White only through the lens of this controversy, you do not have the full picture of who she is or how she got here. Stephanie White is not a journeyman coach. She is not someone the Fever pulled off the street. She is, in many ways, exactly the kind of person you would draw up in a lab if you were trying to design the perfect head coach for the Indiana Fever in this particular moment. She is from West Lebanon, Indiana. She was the Indiana Miss Basketball as a high school player. She went to Purdue, where she led the team to the 1999 national championship game. She was an original member of the Fever roster when the franchise launched, playing for the team from 2000 to 2004. She came back to the organization as an assistant coach in 2011. She was on the staff of the 2012 Fever team that won the franchise's only WNBA championship. She was promoted to head coach in 2015 and led the Fever to the WNBA finals her first year on the job. She left Indiana, did some television work, coached at Vanderbilt, and then took the head job with the Connecticut Sun in 2023. She led that team to the playoffs both seasons she was there. When the Fever fired Christy Sides in October of 2024 after a season where the team had finally made the playoffs but had clearly not maximized what they had in Clark and Boston, Stephanie White was at the top of every smart person's list of replacement candidates. She knew Indiana. She knew winning. She had coached in 2 of the toughest media markets in the WNBA. She was respected around the league. She was hired within days of the Sun and her agreeing to part ways. The hire was, by most accounts at the time, a home run. Her first season, 2025, was complicated. The Fever went on a strong run, made the Commissioner's Cup final, and eventually pushed the Las Vegas Aces to a Game 7 in the WNBA semifinals. That is a deep playoff run by any standard. But the season was also defined by what was missing. And what was missing was Caitlyn Clark for the second half of the year. Clark played 13 games. 13. A groin injury sidelined her for most of the schedule and kept her out for the playoff run that the Fever might have used her to win. So when fans evaluate Stephanie White's first season, they have to evaluate it through the haze of an injury that was not her fault. Some fans choose to give her credit for keeping the team competitive without its star. Other fans look at the same season and say a team that pushed the Aces to 7 games without Clark should have done more, won more, gone further. Both takes are defensible. Neither one of them helps her when the second season starts 1-2 and her in-game decisions are getting publicly torched. We have to talk about Caitlyn Clark, because no honest conversation about Stephanie White's job security can happen without naming the elephant in the room. Caitlyn Clark is the most valuable single asset in women's professional sports. She is 24 years old. She is in the 3rd year of a rookie scale contract that pays her, even with the small raises built into the structure, a fraction of what she generates for her league and her team. She turned down a $1 million contract from Unrivaled, the upstart 3-on-3 league, to stay with the WNBA. She has been loyal to a fault. That loyalty has not been free of strain. Her rookie season, in 2024, was famously rough. She got knocked around. She took hard fouls that did not get called. She watched as the league office, for most of that year, said almost nothing publicly about her treatment. Then last fall, the whole league erupted into a public war over WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert and her alleged comments about Clark being ungrateful. Clark stayed quiet through most of that. When she finally did speak, at her end-of-season exit interview in October of 2025, she said only that she had great respect for Nafisa Collier, the Lynx forward who had originally called Engelbert out, and that Collier, in her words, had said it all. That was a careful statement. Clark did not pile on. She did not say Engelbert should resign, although the broadcaster Stephen A. Smith of ESPN spent multiple segments of First Take saying exactly that on her behalf. She did not threaten to leave the league. She did not say anything about her coach or her team. She picked her words with the care of someone who knew that everything she said would be parsed by every camera in the country for the next 6 months. What we know now, in May of 2026, is that Clark spent the offseason rehabbing her groin injury. She told reporters at the start of training camp that she felt healthy. She told them she was committed to the Fever and to the WNBA. She praised Stephanie White by name when asked, calling her preparation incredible and saying she trusted the coaching staff. None of that is the language of a player who is publicly trying to get her coach fired. But neither is it the unconditional defense that, say, Aya Wilson has offered for her coach in Las Vegas. Clark's support has been there, but it has been the support of a professional, not a partisan. And then there is the off-the-court reality. Clark's endorsement portfolio, as of the start of this season, is reportedly worth in the range of $16 million annually. Nike, Gatorade, State Farm. The companies that have built marketing campaigns around her are still all in. Her merchandise sells out the moment it drops. Her appearances move ratings. She is, in every measurable way, more valuable to the WNBA today than she was when she was drafted. And the contrast between that off-court reality and the on-court reality of her playing in a Fever offense that does not run pick and roll with her in Boston is the contrast that has the entire basketball world talking. Let's give credit where it is due. Jason Whitlock's tweet was inflammatory. The phrase coaching malpractice is the kind of thing you say when you want to start a fight, not when you want to start a conversation. But strip the hostility out of his commentary, and there is a basketball argument underneath it that a lot of more measured analysts have been making for 2 seasons now. The argument goes like this. If you have Caitlyn Clark, one of the best passing point guards in the modern era of the sport, and you have Aliyah Boston, an all-star post player with soft hands and good footwork, the obvious offensive concept is to have those 2 players run pick and roll together. Clark sets up at the top of the key. Boston comes up to set a screen. Clark uses the screen, the defense has to make a decision, and now you have Clark, one of the best shooters alive, with options. She can shoot. She can pass to Boston rolling to the rim. She can kick out to Kelsey Mitchell or Lexi Hull in the corner. It is the same set the NBA has been running with John Stockton and Karl Malone, and Steve Nash and Amare Stoudemire, and Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan, for 30 years. It works because it forces the defense to choose, and there is no good answer. What the Fever have done under Stephanie White, by multiple counts from analysts who have charted the games, is run this set far less often than the talent on the floor would suggest they should. Boston and Clark have spent extended stretches on the floor together without ever actually being involved in the same possession. Clark has been used off the ball more this season than ever before in her career, a stylistic shift that White defended in the preseason by saying it is the ultimate compliment to how teams guard Clark, and that moving her around off the ball gives her some rest and forces defensive adjustments. White also told reporters this is not a revolutionary idea. The trouble is, the results so far do not back up the strategy. The Fever offense looks disjointed. Clark is taking tougher shots than she should have to. Boston is getting fewer touches in the spots where she is most effective. And every analyst in the country is publicly asking the same question. Why are these 2 not running pick and roll every single possession? Whitlock's answer, the answer that lit up social media on the night of May 15th, was that Stephanie White either does not see the obvious or does not want to. Either answer is bad for her. If she does not see it, she is being outcoached by people in the broadcast booth. If she does not want to, she is making an ideological decision about her offense in a season where she does not have the job security to be experimenting. Neither one is a good look. And both of them feed the perception that she is making this team harder to win with, not easier. The local Indianapolis media has historically been protective of the Fever organization. Indianapolis is a basketball town, but it is also a small market by national standards, and the local sports columnists and radio hosts have generally tried to give the home team room to breathe. That has changed in the last 72 hours. The morning after the Mystics' loss, Indianapolis sports radio was wall-to-wall criticism of Stephanie White. The hosts, who had spent the offseason talking up the Fever as a contender, were now openly questioning whether White was the right coach for this roster. They were taking caller after caller from Fever season ticket holders who said they had been at the game and could not understand the rotation choices. They were playing audio of White's post-game press conference, where she answered a question about Clark's tying three-pointer by talking about the team's resilience and execution moments rather than just praising the shot, and they were asking whether the coach seemed reluctant to give Clark the credit she had earned. The Indianapolis Star, the local newspaper, ran a column the next day asking openly whether the Fever front office should be considering a coaching change. That kind of column does not get written in the third game of a season unless something has fundamentally shifted in how the local press views the situation. Other beat writers chimed in on social media. The phrase, "honeymoon over," appeared in multiple stories. And national outlets, smelling blood, started picking up the local coverage and amplifying it. By the morning of May 16th, the question of whether Stephanie White would finish the 2026 season as the head coach of the Indiana Fever had moved from sports talk speculation to legitimate beat reporter territory. Nobody was reporting that her job was in immediate danger. Nobody was saying the front office was considering a move. But the very fact that mainstream journalists were asking the question in the third game of the season told you something about the temperature in Indianapolis. Let's bring Stephen A. Smith into this properly, because his name has been attached to a lot of speculation over the last few days, some of it accurate and some of it not. Here is what Stephen A. Smith has actually said about the Caitlyn Clark and Stephanie White situation, as opposed to the things being attributed to him by accounts trying to get clicks. Smith has been one of the most consistent national voices on Caitlyn Clark's value to the WNBA. He has called her, on multiple occasions, the golden goose of the league. He has said openly that the league's growth is largely attributable to her presence. He has repeatedly criticized WNBA leadership for what he sees as a failure to protect and properly value Clark. He spent much of October 2025 demanding that Commissioner Cathy Engelbert resign over her alleged comments about Clark. On Stephanie White specifically, Smith has been more measured. He has not, as of this recording, called for her firing. He has not said she should resign. What he has done is repeatedly point out that the Fever, as currently constructed and coached, are not getting the most out of Clark. He has questioned the rotations. He has noted on First Take and on his other shows that the criticism of the Fever's offensive scheme is being driven by real basketball analysis, not just by fan frustration. He has framed the situation as a test of whether the Fever organization, from the front office to the coaching staff, is ready to handle the responsibility of building a championship team around the most important player in the sport. That is, in fairness, a more sophisticated take than the social media version of it. Smith is not saying White is a bad coach. He is saying the situation is bigger than her and that the organization needs to figure out whether the current setup is working. The implicit suggestion is that if it is not working, someone is eventually going to have to answer for it, and head coaches in professional sports are usually the first to take the fall when things go sideways. That is not a prediction of White's firing. It is a recognition of how these things usually go. And here is something worth noting that has gotten less attention than it deserves. Smith has been remarkably restrained in not piling on White personally. He could have. The story would have been easy. He has chosen not to, at least so far. Whether that restraint continues if the Fever drop to 1-3 or 1-4 is a different question. We cannot talk about this without going back to last October, because the temperature around the Fever organization today is partly a leftover from a fire that was set somewhere else entirely. In late September of 2025, Nafisa Collier of the Minnesota Lynx delivered her now famous 4.5-minute statement accusing Cathy Engelbert of dismissive and disrespectful comments about Caitlyn Clark and about WNBA officiating in general. Engelbert denied the comments. The league erupted. Players up and down the league spoke out, including Stephanie White herself, who used a local Indianapolis radio appearance to defend Clark and to push back on the league office. White's words at that time were protective. She called Clark a 23-year-old kid, which she still was at the time, who loved the game and who had become a pawn in other people's narratives. She compared Clark to Tiger Woods and Serena Williams in terms of the level of attention she was navigating. She said she hated it for Clark. Those were not the words of a coach trying to undermine her star player. Those were the words of a coach standing up for her. But here is what fans tend to forget. Even as White was defending Clark publicly last fall, the Indianapolis sports media was already starting to question some of her in-game decisions from the 2025 season. The substitutions in the playoff loss to Las Vegas. The lineups. The minutes distribution. Those criticisms got buried at the time by the larger story of the commissioner controversy, but they did not go away. They were sitting there, waiting for an opportunity to come back. And the May 15th loss to the Mystics gave them exactly that opportunity. So when fans and analysts criticize White today, they are not just reacting to one bad game. They are reacting to the accumulated frustration of about a year and a half of decisions that have not quite added up. The protective public posture from October has not been forgotten. People remember that she stood up for Clark when it mattered. But that goodwill does not extend forever, and certainly does not extend through losses that fans believe were caused by her own choices. If we are going to ask whether Stephanie White could lose her job this season, we have to ask who would actually make that decision and what their relationship with White looks like. The answer to that question runs through Kelly Krauskopf, the Fever's president of basketball operations. Krauskopf is one of the most respected executives in the WNBA. She built the Fever organization in its earliest days, left for a stint with the Indiana Pacers, and came back specifically to lead this team into what she has called a new era of Fever basketball. Krauskopf hired Stephanie White personally. She has spoken publicly and warmly about White's basketball IQ, her leadership style, and her fit with the franchise. Krauskopf was on the staff with White during the 2012 championship run. There is a personal relationship there. There is a professional history. There is, frankly, a lot of reluctance that would have to be overcome before the front office would move on from a coach Krauskopf handpicked just 18 months ago. But Krauskopf is also an executive whose entire job is the long-term health of the Fever franchise. And the long-term health of the Fever franchise is, more than anything else, the long-term retention and happiness of Caitlyn Clark. Clark's rookie scale contract runs through the 2027 season. After that, she will be a free agent for the first time in her career. The decisions Krauskopf makes between now and the summer of 2027 will determine whether Clark stays in Indianapolis or whether she becomes the most consequential free agent move in the history of women's basketball. If, at any point between now and that free agency window, Krauskopf comes to believe that the current coaching setup is making Clark less likely to re-sign, she will make a change. Not because she does not like Stephanie White. Not because she does not value the work White has put in. But because keeping Caitlyn Clark in a Fever uniform past 2027 is the single most important strategic priority any executive in the WNBA has, and no head coaching relationship is worth sacrificing that priority. That is the calculus White is operating under, whether she wants to acknowledge it or not. She is not just coaching to win games. She is coaching to keep her star happy enough to commit to Indianapolis for the rest of her career. And every time a play gets drawn up that uses that star as a decoy, every time a substitution decision keeps that star on the bench for 6 minutes in a close game, every time a post-game press conference includes any answer that sounds like anything less than full-throated praise of that star, the calculus tilts a little further away from White and toward a change. In fairness, Stephanie White has not been silent through all of this. She has made the media rounds. She has answered questions about Clark, about the rotations, about the strategy. And she has, in her own measured way, tried to defend her choices. On the question of moving Clark off the ball more often, White told reporters in the preseason that this is not some revolutionary idea, and that part of the reason for doing it is the way teams have been guarding Clark. Defenders have been pressuring her 94 feet, denying her the ball at the top of the key, blitzing her every time she tries to come off a screen. White's argument is that moving Clark off the ball, having her come off down screens like a shooting guard rather than initiating every possession as a point guard, both reduces the physical wear on her and forces defenses to think harder about where she is going to appear. That argument is not crazy. There is real basketball logic to it. Steph Curry, the closest male comparison to Clark in terms of off-the-dribble shooting range, has spent his entire career being moved off the ball by Steve Kerr and the Warriors precisely because defenses cannot handle him in motion. If White can find a way to use Clark in motion the way Kerr has used Curry, the Fever could become a nightmare to guard. The problem is that doing that successfully requires the rest of the offense to be running like a Swiss watch, and the Fever offense, in the first 3 games of the season, has been running like a thing that is not a Swiss watch. The off-ball movement requires precise spacing, sharp screens from Boston, secondary playmakers who can put pressure on the defense when Clark is in the corner. None of that is happening yet at the level it would need to. And when the system breaks down, the player who suffers most is the one who is being asked to play out of position relative to her natural strengths. Right now, that is Clark. White has also defended her post-game comments about Clark, saying she always tries to praise her players collectively rather than singling individuals out for credit. That is, again, a defensible coaching philosophy. Some of the best coaches in basketball history have been emphatic about not building up individuals at the expense of team identity. But when your team is 1-2 and your individual is Caitlyn Clark, a moment of public praise is not a coaching philosophy issue. It is a basic public relations decision. The fact that White seemed to miss that, in her post-game answer about the tying three-pointer, was either a reflection of how stressed she was or a reflection of something more concerning. Fans noticed. Analysts noticed. Stephen A. Smith noticed. Throughout all of this, the one voice we have not heard much from is the most important one. Caitlyn Clark, as of this recording, has not publicly criticized her coach. She has not, in any post-game interview or press availability, suggested that she is unhappy with how she is being used. She has consistently said things like, "We have to be better as a team, we have to execute, I have to make the shots I get." She has taken on responsibility for her own play and has not deflected it onto coaching decisions. That is significant. Caitlyn Clark is not a player who has trouble speaking her mind when she has something to say. Her exit interview last October, after the Engelbert controversy broke, was the model of how to deliver a message without being explicit about it. She said Fee had said it all. She did not need to say more. Everyone understood what she meant. If she were truly furious with Stephanie White right now, there are 100 different ways she could signal it without ever saying a word that could be quoted against her. She has not used any of them. What that probably tells us is that, whatever frustrations Clark may have with the offensive system or with specific game decisions, she has not given up on the coaching staff. She has not concluded that the situation is unfixable. She is still operating as though Stephanie White is going to figure it out. That patience is not infinite. But it exists. And as long as it exists, it gives White a runway that, frankly, the noise around her right now suggests she might not actually have. There is also a layer to this that we should acknowledge honestly. Clark is 24 years old. She is famously private about internal team dynamics. The people who know her well have said she would rather take a loss than throw a teammate or a coach under the bus in public. That personality has been part of why fans love her, and it has been part of why the WNBA front office has gotten away with paying her $76,000 a year while she generates millions for the league. If the day ever comes when Clark publicly criticizes her coach or her organization, the situation has already moved well past the point of recovery. That day has not come. The fact that it has not is the single biggest reason Stephanie White is still employed today. We have to widen the lens for a minute, because everything happening in Indianapolis is happening against the backdrop of a league that is still trying to figure out how to manage its own success. The collective bargaining negotiations that dominated last fall finally produced a new agreement during the offseason. Player salaries are going up. Revenue sharing has been restructured. The basic financial relationship between players and league has been reset on terms much more favorable to the players than the previous deal. That is good news for the WNBA. It removes the labor dispute as an immediate crisis. But Cathy Engelbert is still the commissioner. The relationship between the league office and the players' union, while less openly hostile than it was last October, is still being rebuilt. The officiating task force that Engelbert announced in Las Vegas has delivered some recommendations, and the league has made changes, but every hard foul that does not get called still becomes a referendum on whether the changes are actually working. The Portland Fire and Toronto Tempo are now playing their first WNBA seasons, expanding the league to 14 teams. The growth story is real, and the financial picture is healthier than it has ever been. What this means for the Fever, and for Stephanie White, is that the spotlight on Indianapolis is brighter than ever. The league needs Caitlyn Clark and the Fever to be a success story. The new media rights deal is paying out, and the broadcast partners want compelling national games. Every Fever broadcast on national television is one where ratings will be examined down to the minute, and every conclusion drawn from those ratings will eventually feed back into how the front office in Indianapolis evaluates its head coach. That is the pressure White is under that, frankly, no Fever coach has ever been under before. Christy Sides got fired after a 20-20 season because she did not max out the talent. Lynn Dunn coached the team to a championship and was still pushed out. The Fever job is one of the most scrutinized in women's professional sports, and the scrutiny is only getting more intense as the league grows. Let's talk about what actually happens next, because the timeline matters. The Fever play their next several games against opponents who, on paper, they should be competitive with. There are stretches of the early schedule that should give them a chance to find their rhythm. If White can stabilize the rotation, find the right minute split between Clark and the bench, and start running more pick and roll with Boston, the team could easily climb back to 4-3 or 5-2 within 2 weeks. At that point, the noise around her job goes away, at least temporarily, and she gets the chance to coach the rest of the season without the constant question of her job security looming over every decision. If, on the other hand, the Fever drop the next 2 games and fall to 1-4, the situation changes very quickly. At 1-4, with a roster this talented, in a season this anticipated, the front office will start to face questions it cannot easily deflect. Reporters will ask Kelly Krauskopf directly whether she has confidence in her coach. Krauskopf will either give a strong vote of support, which buys White another 2 or 3 weeks, or she will give a more cautious answer, which functionally puts White on a public watch. Coaches rarely survive long after being publicly placed on a watch in any sport. Once the speculation starts, the locker room reads it, the opposing teams read it, and the games get harder, not easier. The realistic worst-case scenario, the one nobody in Indianapolis wants to think about but several reporters have privately discussed, is a 1-7 start. If that happened, with Clark healthy and the roster intact, it would be very difficult for any front office to defend the status quo. The Fever do not have to win the championship this year, but they do have to demonstrate competence and progress. A 1-7 start would not look like either. The realistic best-case scenario is a 6-3 start, where the rotation issues get figured out, Clark gets more on-ball touches and runs pick and roll with Boston, and the team starts looking like the contender people predicted in the preseason. That outcome saves White's season and probably saves her job, although it does not eliminate the underlying tensions that have made this all so volatile. We have to circle back one more time to the issue that hangs over everything, because it is the issue that nobody in Indianapolis can stop thinking about, even if nobody wants to say it out loud. Caitlyn Clark's rookie scale contract runs through the 2027 season. After that, she becomes a free agent. And free agency in the new WNBA, under the new collective bargaining agreement, is not what it used to be. Salaries are higher. Maximum contracts are bigger. Player movement is going to be more common. The Fever cannot assume Clark will simply re-sign because she is from the Midwest and likes the organization. She will have options. Real options. 8-figure options. In markets that may be more glamorous than Indianapolis. If Clark were to leave Indiana in 2027, it would be the biggest single transaction in WNBA history. It would also be a catastrophic outcome for the Fever organization, which has built its entire economic and competitive model around her presence. Season ticket prices, sponsorship deals, the upcoming Gainbridge Fieldhouse renovations, all of it has been calibrated to the assumption that Clark stays. If she leaves, that whole structure has to be rebuilt. So when we ask whether the Fever front office will be patient with Stephanie White through a rough start, we have to remember that they are not just evaluating wins and losses. They are evaluating every decision through the lens of how it affects Clark's eventual free agency choice. If they believe White's coaching is making Clark unhappy enough to consider leaving, they will move on from White regardless of the record. If they believe Clark is content with White even through losing stretches, White will get a longer leash than a coach with her record would normally deserve. That is the strange position any coach of a generational star ends up in. You are not really being evaluated on the same scale as other coaches. You are being evaluated on whether your player wants to keep playing for you. And the only person who can really answer that question is the player herself, who, to her credit, has not publicly answered it either way. One thing we should be careful about is jumping to conclusions about what is happening inside the Fever locker room based on what we see from the outside. Locker rooms are private. The relationships between coaches and players play out in ways that fans almost never see. The same head coach who looks rigid and frustrating on television might be the warm and supportive presence the players actually need behind closed doors. The same head coach who looks calm and in control on television might be a screaming nightmare in private. We do not really know. What we do know is that, by the public statements of players who have been on Stephanie White's teams, including her time in Connecticut, she has generally been a coach players want to play for. Veterans have spoken about her preparation and her ability to communicate game plans clearly. Younger players have talked about her willingness to develop them and give them opportunities. None of that is automatic in coaching, and the fact that she has those reviews from previous stops is part of why she got the Fever job in the first place. We also know that, by all reporting from the offseason, Clark and White spent significant time together preparing for this season. They had multiple meetings about how the offense would run. They talked about how to manage Clark's workload and protect her health. Clark, in her public comments, has consistently described those conversations in positive terms. None of that guarantees the relationship is perfect. But it does suggest that the relationship is functional, professional, and built on real communication. The danger for White right now is not that the relationship with Clark falls apart. The danger is that the external pressure becomes so loud that the front office concludes a change is necessary even if the internal relationships are still working. That is how coaches get fired in professional sports more often than fans realize. Not because the players hate them. Because the noise around them becomes so loud that the organization cannot function. Whether the noise around White will get to that level depends almost entirely on what happens in the next 2 to 3 weeks. If you want a sense of how this might play out, look at parallels from other leagues. In the NBA, head coaches of generational talents have historically been on shorter leashes than other head coaches, even when the talent itself does not publicly demand a change. Tyronn Lue was fired 6 games into a season by the Cleveland Cavaliers when LeBron James was no longer there to protect him. Mike Brown was fired by the Lakers fewer than 10 games into a season because the team was not winning fast enough around Kobe Bryant. The pattern across decades is consistent. When a franchise is built around a single transcendent player, the head coach is functionally on a probationary contract that gets renewed week by week based on performance and vibe. Stephanie White is now operating under that kind of contract, whether the formal terms of her actual contract reflect it or not. She is the coach of the most valuable player in women's basketball, on a team that is supposed to contend for a championship, in a market that is paying intense attention. That is a high-pressure job in any sport. In a sport where the player she coaches generates more individual revenue than the rest of the roster combined, it is the highest pressure job in the league. The good news for White, if there is good news, is that she has a deep well of equity in Indianapolis. She is a hometown coach. She has won there before, both as a player and as part of the championship staff. She has been a consistent advocate for Clark in public. None of those things are nothing. They all matter when the front office sits down and has the hard conversations. But none of them are guarantees either. Coaches with more equity than White have been pushed out for less. There is one more thing I want to say about all of this, and it is the thing that almost no commentator has been willing to say out loud over the last few days. The reason this story has become as big as it has, the reason a 1-2 start is being treated like a 5-alarm fire, is partly because women's basketball has finally become big enough to attract the kind of coverage that men's basketball has had for 50 years. That coverage is not always fair. It is not always nuanced. It is often driven by the engagement metrics of social media platforms that reward outrage over analysis. And the result is that coaches like Stephanie White, who would have been able to coach through a rough start in relative obscurity 10 years ago, are now operating in a full national spotlight that punishes every mistake. That is not a defense of bad coaching. If White's decisions are wrong, they are wrong, and fans have every right to criticize them. But it is worth recognizing that the version of the WNBA we are watching now is fundamentally different from the WNBA that existed before Caitlyn Clark arrived. The coverage is bigger. The stakes are higher. The pressure is enormous. And not all of that pressure is being distributed fairly across the people in the league. Kathy Engelbert is still the commissioner. Stephanie White is the coach being asked to manage the player whose value Engelbert allegedly dismissed. The officiating crews that Cheryl Reeve called malpractice are still officiating games. The structural problems that boiled over last October have not all been solved. And in the meantime, the coach who has actually been one of the most consistent public defenders of her star player is now the one taking the heat for a team that is 1-2 after 3 games. There is something about that distribution of accountability that does not quite add up. White is being asked to carry the weight of expectations that the entire league has created. She may or may not be the right coach for this team. She may or may not survive the season. But before we conclude that everything is her fault, we should at least notice that the people who set up the situation, the ones who built the franchise around a generational star and then asked the head coach to figure it out without ever quite giving her all the resources or all the support, deserve some of the scrutiny too. So here is where we are. 3 games into the 2026 WNBA season, Stephanie White is the head coach of the Indiana Fever, and her job is in more doubt than any other coach in the league. Not because her player wants her gone. Not because her front office has lost faith. But because the noise around her decisions has gotten loud enough that everybody is asking the question, including the people who have to make the decision. The next 2 weeks will determine almost everything. If the Fever win, she stays. And the conversation moves on. If the Fever lose, the conversation gets louder, the questions get harder, and the path to a coaching change starts to open up. Caitlyn Clark, the player at the center of all of it, will keep showing up. She will keep playing. She will keep saying nothing that can be used against her or anyone else. She is good at this. She has been good at it since she was in college. And as long as she keeps her counsel, Stephanie White gets to keep her job for at least 1 more game. I want to leave you with a question. If you were Kelly Krauskopf, the executive who hired Stephanie White just 18 months ago, the executive whose entire career is now tied to keeping Caitlyn Clark happy in Indianapolis, what would you do right now? Would you stay patient and let your hand-picked coach work through a rough start? Or would you start having quiet conversations about alternatives, just in case? There is no easy answer. The people who tell you there is are not paying attention. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think Stephanie White's chances are of finishing the season in Indianapolis. Tell me whether Caitlyn Clark would defend her if it came to it. And while you are down there, hit that subscribe button if you have not already, because we're going to keep covering this story all season long, every week, with the same level of detail and the same willingness to ask the questions other people are too scared to ask. The next video is going to break down the specific offensive sets the Fever are running and exactly what is going wrong with them, and you will want to be subscribed when it goes live. Thanks for watching. Take care of each other, and I will see you next time.